In a quiet suburban neighborhood, an unexpected alliance forms between Jamal, a young black delivery driver, and Mrs. Henderson, an elderly white woman living alone. What begins as a routine package drop-off evolves into a gripping tale of compassion, community, and courage. As Jamal uncovers troubling signs of abuse, he finds himself drawn into a complex web of relationships and long-buried secrets. The story unfolds against a backdrop of racial tensions and generational divides, challenging preconceptions and revealing the power of human connection. As the community rallies around Mrs. Henderson, a shocking revelation threatens to upend everything they thought they knew. This heart-wrenching yet ultimately uplifting narrative explores themes of family, redemption, and the transformative power of kindness. And if you love your family and want to hear more incredible stories like this one, subscribe to our channel. The sun beat down on the suburban street as Jamal maneuvered his delivery truck through the familiar neighborhood. He had been working this route for months, but today felt different. As he approached the Henderson residence, a modest two-story house with faded blue shutters, he noticed something that made him pause. Mrs. Henderson, a frail woman in her 70s, stood at her living room window. Her usual warm smile was absent, replaced by a look of distress that sent a chill down Jamal's spine. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he approached the front door with the day's package, Jamal's eyes were drawn to Mrs. Henderson's arms. Angry purple bruises marred her pale skin, partially hidden by the sleeves of her cardigan. His heart raced as he realized the implications of what he was seeing. Jamal hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He wasn't sure if he should get involved. After all, he was just the delivery guy. But the fear in Mrs. Henderson's eyes haunted him. Taking a deep breath, he pressed the button. The chime echoed through the house, followed by the slow shuffling of feet. Mrs. Henderson opened the door, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Hello, Jamal. Another delivery today?" Jamal nodded, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes, ma'am. I've got a package for you. But are you okay, Mrs. Henderson? You seem a bit off today." Mrs. Henderson's smile faltered for a moment before she caught herself. "Oh, I'm fine, dear. Just a bit under the weather. Nothing to worry about." She reached for the package, wincing slightly as she extended her arm. Jamal couldn't ignore the pain in her movement. "Mrs. Henderson, I couldn't help but notice your arms. Are you sure everything's all right? If you need help, I can—" No, she interrupted, her voice taking on a slight edge of panic. "I'm just clumsy in my old age, always bumping into things. Please don't trouble yourself." Jamal wanted to press further, but he could see the fear in Mrs. Henderson's eyes. He handed over the package, his mind racing with what to do next. "Well, if you're sure. But please, Mrs. Henderson, if you ever need anything, even just to talk, I'm here." She nodded, a flicker of gratitude passing across her face before she retreated back into the house. Jamal stood on the porch for a moment, conflicted. As he turned to leave, movement caught his eye. A man emerged from the house next door, his gait purposeful and his expression dark. He locked eyes with Jamal, and a chill ran down the young man's spine. There was something menacing in the stranger's gaze, a silent warning that made Jamal's instincts scream danger. As the man disappeared down the street, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed something sinister. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Mrs. Henderson's distress, the bruises, and now this threatening figure. Jamal climbed back into his truck, his mind made up. He couldn't simply drive away and pretend he hadn't seen anything. Mrs. Henderson needed help, and he was determined to find a way to provide it, no matter the consequences. Jamal's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on his shoulders, but he knew he couldn't ignore what he had seen. Taking a deep breath, he dialed 911. 911 what's your emergency?" The operator's calm voice cut through Jamal's racing thoughts. I think I need to report a case of elder abuse," Jamal said, his voice low as he glanced toward Mrs. Henderson's house. "I'm a delivery driver, and I just saw one of my regular customers, an elderly woman. She had bruises on her arms, and she seemed really scared." The operator's tone shifted to one of concern. "Can you give me the address and describe what you saw?" Jamal relayed the details, including his observations of Mrs. Henderson and the suspicious man he had seen. The operator listened attentively, asking clarifying questions. "Thank you for reporting this, sir," the operator said. "We're dispatching officers to the location now. Can you stay in the area until they arrive?" Jamal agreed, ending the call with a mix of relief and apprehension. He had done the right thing, but he couldn't help worrying about the consequences. What if he was wrong? What if Mrs. Henderson got angry at him for interfering? As he waited, Jamal kept a watchful eye on the Henderson residence. Through the window, he could see Mrs. Henderson moving about, her movements stiff and cautious. Suddenly, the man from earlier reappeared, striding purposefully toward her front door. Jamal's heart raced as he watched the scene unfold. The man entered the house without knocking, his body language aggressive. Through the window, Jamal could see Mrs. Henderson's posture change immediately. She seemed to shrink into herself, her earlier fear now painfully evident. The minutes crawled by agonizingly slow. Jamal felt helpless, watching the shadows move behind the curtains, imagining the worst. He was tempted to intervene himself, but he knew he had to wait for the professionals. Finally, the welcome sound of sirens pierced the air. 2 police cruisers pulled up to the curb, and 4 officers emerged. Jamal quickly approached them, eager to share what he had seen. "Officers, thank you for coming," Jamal said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm the one who called. The woman who lives here, Mrs. Henderson. She's in there with a man. I think she's in danger." The lead officer, a stern-faced woman with graying hair, nodded. "We'll handle it from here, sir. Please stay back." Jamal watched anxiously as the officers approached the house. They knocked on the door, announcing their presence. After a tense moment, the door opened, revealing Mrs. Henderson. The man stood behind her, his hand on her shoulder, in what might have looked like a protective gesture to an outsider. But Jamal could see the way Mrs. Henderson flinched at the touch. The officer spoke with them both, their voices too low for Jamal to hear. He saw Mrs. Henderson's eyes dart nervously between the officers and the man. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Mrs. Henderson's composure cracked. It's my neighbor," she said, her voice barely audible from where Jamal stood. "He's been threatening me. I didn't know what to do." The admission seemed to release a floodgate. Mrs. Henderson began to sob, years of pent-up fear and pain pouring out. The officers quickly separated her from the man, who protested loudly as he was led away for questioning. As one officer comforted Mrs. Henderson and another took her statement, Jamal felt a mix of relief and sadness wash over him. He had helped bring this abuse to light, but the road ahead for Mrs. Henderson would not be easy. He silently vowed to do whatever he could to support her through the challenging times ahead. In the days following the incident, Jamal found himself increasingly drawn into Mrs. Henderson's world. The police investigation had set wheels in motion, but Jamal couldn't shake the feeling of responsibility he felt towards the elderly woman. He began making regular visits to her home, ostensibly to check on her well-being, but also to provide a sense of security and companionship. On one such visit, Jamal arrived to find Mrs. Henderson sitting on her porch, a wistful expression on her face. As he approached, he noticed an old photograph album open on her lap. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Henderson," Jamal called out, his voice warm and friendly. "How are you doing today?" Mrs. Henderson looked up, a small smile gracing her features. "Oh, Jamal, it's good to see you. I'm doing better, thank you. Would you like to join me for a while?" Jamal nodded, settling into the chair next to her. His eyes were drawn to the photographs, filled with images of a younger Mrs. Henderson in glamorous dresses, often standing on stages with microphones. "I didn't know you were a singer," Jamal said, his curiosity piqued. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up with a spark that Jamal hadn't seen before. "Oh yes, in another lifetime it seems. I used to perform in clubs all over the city. Jazz was my passion." As she spoke, her voice took on a dreamy quality, transporting her back to those golden days. Jamal listened, enthralled, as Mrs. Henderson shared stories of smoky clubs, late-night jam sessions, and the thrill of performing for appreciative audiences. "I had dreams of making it big," she confessed, a touch of sadness creeping into her voice. "But life had other plans. I met my husband, settled down, and before I knew it, those dreams were just memories." Jamal felt a connection forming between them, bridging the gap of age and experience. "I understand that feeling," he said softly. "I've always loved music too. I play the guitar, though I've never performed for anyone but my family." Mrs. Henderson's eyes sparkled with interest. "You play? Oh, how wonderful. You must bring your guitar next time you visit. It's been so long since I've heard live music in this house." Jamal promised he would, and as he left that day, he felt a sense of purpose growing within him. He realized that in helping Mrs. Henderson, he wasn't just protecting her from harm. He was helping her rediscover parts of herself that had been long buried. True to his word, on his next visit, Jamal brought his guitar. Mrs. Henderson's face lit up at the sight of the instrument, and she eagerly ushered him inside. As Jamal began to play, something magical happened. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes, swaying gently to the music. Then, softly at first, she began to sing. Her voice, though roughened by age, still carried the warmth and emotion of a true jazz singer. They spent hours that afternoon, Jamal playing and Mrs. Henderson singing. They worked through old standards that Mrs. Henderson remembered from her performing days, and Jamal even taught her some more modern songs. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the living room windows, Mrs. Henderson wiped a tear from her eye. "Thank you, Jamal," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I haven't felt this alive in years." Jamal felt a lump form in his own throat. He realized that in trying to help Mrs. Henderson, he had discovered something profound about the healing power of music and human connection. As he packed up his guitar to leave, Jamal made a silent vow. He would continue to visit, to play music, and to help Mrs. Henderson reclaim the joy that had been stolen from her. In her, he had found not just someone to protect, but a friend, a mentor, and a kindred spirit. The bond forming between them transcended age, race, and circumstance. It was a testament to the power of compassion and shared passion, a beacon of hope in a world that had dealt Mrs. Henderson so much hardship. As Jamal drove home that evening, he felt a sense of purpose and connection that he had never experienced before, all because he had chosen to reach out to a stranger in need. As the days turned into weeks, the story of Mrs. Henderson and Jamal's unlikely friendship began to spread through the neighborhood. What had started as one man's concern for an elderly neighbor had blossomed into a community-wide movement of support and protection. Jamal, driven by his growing bond with Mrs. Henderson and his desire to prevent similar situations, decided to take action on a larger scale. He reached out to his neighbors, organizing a community meeting to discuss how they could better support vulnerable residents like Mrs. Henderson. The response was overwhelming. On a warm Saturday afternoon, the local community center was packed with concerned citizens. People from all walks of life, young families, retirees, and everyone in between, had come together, united in their desire to make a difference. Jamal stood at the front of the room, his hands shaking slightly as he addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "We're here today because one of our own, Mrs. Henderson, has been suffering in silence. But her story isn't unique. There are others in our community who need our help, our protection, and our support." As Jamal shared Mrs. Henderson's story, with her permission, a hush fell over the room. People listened with rapt attention, many wiping away tears as they heard of the abuse and isolation she had endured. But the mood shifted as Jamal began to outline his ideas for change. He proposed creating a neighborhood watch program, specifically focused on checking in on elderly and vulnerable residents. He suggested setting up a support hotline, where people could report concerns or ask for help. And he emphasized the importance of breaking down the barriers of isolation that often allowed abuse to go unnoticed. As Jamal finished speaking, the room erupted in applause. But what happened next took everyone by surprise. One by one, people began to stand up and share their own stories. An elderly man spoke of his fear of falling and being unable to call for help. A middle-aged woman tearfully recounted her struggle to care for her aging parents while working full-time. A teenager described his friendship with an elderly neighbor and how it had changed his perspective on aging. The meeting, which had been scheduled for an hour, stretched on for 3. People shared resources, offered support, and made connections. Ideas flowed freely, from organizing regular community dinners to setting up a volunteer transportation service for those who couldn't drive. As the meeting drew to a close, there was a palpable sense of hope and determination in the room. Committees were formed, action plans were drafted, and follow-up meetings were scheduled. What had started as a response to one woman's plight had transformed into a community-wide commitment to change. Jamal stood at the back of the room, watching as people exchanged contact information and made plans to check in on neighbors they had never spoken to before. He felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. He had hoped to make a difference, but he never imagined the ripple effect his actions would have. As the last of the attendees filed out, an elderly woman Jamal didn't recognize approached him. She took his hand in both of hers, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said simply. "You've given us all hope." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He realized that, in trying to help Mrs. Henderson, he had sparked a movement that could change countless lives. The community had come together in a way he had never seen before, crossing boundaries of age, race, and social status. As he locked up the community center, Jamal's mind was already racing with next steps. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he was no longer alone in this fight. A community had awakened, ready to stand up for its most vulnerable members. Driving home, Jamal couldn't help but smile. He thought of Mrs. Henderson and how her life had already begun to change. He thought of all the other Mrs. Hendersons out there, suffering in silence, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. This was just the beginning, he realized. Together, they could create a community where everyone felt safe, valued, and connected. The momentum generated by the community meeting showed no signs of slowing down. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. What had once been a collection of houses occupied by strangers was rapidly becoming a tight-knit community, bound together by a shared commitment to protecting its most vulnerable members. At the center of this whirlwind of activity was Mrs. Henderson. Her story had touched hearts and ignited a passion for change, and now she found herself thrust into a spotlight she had never expected. The local media had caught wind of the community's efforts, and suddenly, Mrs. Henderson and Jamal found themselves at the center of a growing movement. As preparations for a candlelight vigil in Mrs. Henderson's honor got underway, Jamal found himself being interviewed by a local news crew. Standing in front of Mrs. Henderson's house, now adorned with colorful banners and signs of support, Jamal spoke from the heart. "This isn't just about Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice steady and clear. It's about recognizing that we all have a responsibility to look out for one another. It's about understanding that true community means nobody gets left behind or forgotten. The reporter nodded, clearly moved by Jamal's words. And what would you say to other communities facing similar issues? Jamal paused for a moment, considering his words carefully. I'd say that change starts with one person caring enough to act. It doesn't take grand gestures or heroic acts. Sometimes it's as simple as knocking on a neighbor's door and asking if they're okay. We all have the power to make a difference, to create a community where everyone feels safe and valued. As the interview wrapped up, Jamal could see a crowd gathering for the vigil. People of all ages were arriving, carrying candles and homemade signs. The atmosphere was one of quiet determination and hope. Mrs. Henderson emerged from her house, supported by two of her newfound friends from the community. The sight of her brought a hush over the crowd. She looked around, her eyes wide with emotion, taking in the sea of faces that had come to support her. With trembling hands, Mrs. Henderson took the microphone that was offered to her. Her voice, though soft, carried across the hushed gathering. I never thought I'd be standing here like this, she began, her words halting at first, but gaining strength as she continued. For so long, I lived in fear and shame. I thought I was alone, that no one would understand or care about what was happening to me. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. But thanks to Jamal, and to all of you, I've learned that I'm not alone. None of us are alone, not when we have a community like this. As Mrs. Henderson spoke, she began to share more of her story. She talked about the years of abuse she had endured, the isolation she had felt, and the despair that had nearly overwhelmed her. But she also spoke of hope, of the kindness she had experienced in recent weeks, and of her determination to reclaim her life. I want you all to know, she said, her voice growing stronger, that it's never too late to start over. It's never too late to ask for help or to offer help to someone in need. We all have the power to make a difference in someone's life, just as you've all made a difference in mine. As Mrs. Henderson finished speaking, the crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Candles were lit, their soft glow illuminating faces etched with compassion and resolve. The vigil had become more than just a show of support for one woman. It was a declaration of community values, a promise to look out for one another. In the days that followed, the impact of the vigil and Mrs. Henderson's words rippled through the community and beyond. Local officials reached out, promising to implement new programs to support elderly and vulnerable residents. Social services agencies reported an uptick in calls from people seeking help or offering to volunteer. For Mrs. Henderson, the changes were profound. With the support of her newfound community, she began to reclaim her life. She started attending therapy sessions, slowly working through the trauma of her past. She rekindled old friendships and formed new ones, filling her days with social interactions that brought joy and laughter back into her life. Jamal, too, found his life transformed. What had started as a simple act of concern had blossomed into a calling. He became a vocal advocate for community engagement and elder protection, speaking at local events and working with city officials to implement new safety measures. As the community continued to rally around Mrs. Henderson and others like her, a new sense of purpose and unity emerged. People who had once been strangers now greeted each other warmly on the streets, checked in on elderly neighbors, and came together regularly for community events. The story of Mrs. Henderson and the community that came together to support her became a beacon of hope, inspiring similar movements in neighboring towns and cities. It was a powerful reminder of the change that can occur when people choose to care, to act, and to stand together against injustice and isolation. The wave of community action and support continued to grow, but amidst the positive changes, A significant development brought both relief and new challenges. On a crisp autumn morning, news spread quickly through the neighborhood. The man who had been threatening Mrs. Henderson had been arrested. Jamal received the news via a phone call from one of the officers involved in the case. His heart raced as he listened to the details. The police had gathered enough evidence, thanks in part to the community's vigilance and Mrs. Henderson's courage in speaking out, to make an arrest. As Jamal hung up the phone, a mix of emotions washed over him. Relief, certainly. The immediate threat to Mrs. Henderson was gone, but he also felt a strange sense of apprehension. This arrest marked the end of one chapter, but what would come next? Word of the arrest spread rapidly through the community's newly established networks. Neighbors called each other, text messages flew back and forth, and soon a crowd had gathered near Mrs. Henderson's house, their faces a mix of jubilation and concern. Jamal made his way through the crowd, gently pushing past well-wishers to reach Mrs. Henderson's front door. He found her sitting in her living room, surrounded by a small group of her closest new friends. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a cup of tea. "Mrs. Henderson," Jamal said softly, kneeling beside her chair. "How are you doing?" She looked up at him, her eyes filled with unshed tears. I don't know how to feel, Jamal. I'm relieved, of course, but also scared. What happens now?" Jamal took her hand, squeezing it gently. "Now, we keep moving forward. You're not alone in this, Mrs. Henderson. We're all here for you, every step of the way." As the day progressed, the initial excitement of the arrest gave way to a more subdued atmosphere of reflection and planning. Community leaders gathered to discuss the next steps, how to support Mrs. Henderson through the legal process, how to ensure the safety of other vulnerable residents, and how to maintain the momentum of their newfound unity. Jamal found himself at the center of these discussions, his voice carrying weight earned through his unwavering commitment to Mrs. Henderson and the community. But as he spoke about future plans and ongoing support, he was careful to redirect attention away from himself. "The real hero here is Mrs. Henderson," he said during an impromptu gathering at the community center. "Her courage in speaking out, in sharing her story, that's what brought us all together. That's what's making our community stronger." His words resonated with the crowd, sparking a renewed sense of purpose. People began to share ideas for community programs, volunteer initiatives, and education efforts to prevent future instances of abuse and isolation. As the meeting wound down, an elderly gentleman approached Jamal. "Son," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "what you've done here, it's remarkable. You've shown us all what it means to be a true neighbor, a true community member." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. "Thank you, sir," he replied. "But I didn't do this alone. We all did this together." The man nodded, a small smile crossing his weathered face. "That's true, but it took someone to light the spark. You did that, son. Don't forget it." As Jamal made his way home that evening, he reflected on the man's words. He felt a deep sense of pride, not in himself, but in what the community had accomplished together. They had taken a stand against abuse and isolation, had shown that change was possible when people came together with a common purpose. But he also knew that their work was far from over. The arrest was a significant step, but it was just one part of a larger journey. There would be legal proceedings to navigate, ongoing support for Mrs. Henderson to coordinate, and the continued effort to maintain and strengthen the community bonds that had formed. As he reached his front door, Jamal's phone buzzed with a message. It was from Mrs. Henderson. "Thank you, Jamal, for everything. You've given me my life back." Jamal smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities to make a difference. And he knew that whatever came next, they would face it as a community, united in their commitment to care for one another. The weeks following the arrest saw a flurry of activity in the community. As the legal proceedings against Mrs. Henderson's abuser began, the neighborhood rallied to support her through every step of the process. But alongside this ongoing support, there was a palpable sense that the community was ready to celebrate how far they had come. It was in this spirit that plans for a community-wide event began to take shape. What started as a small gathering to honor those who had helped Mrs. Henderson soon evolved into something much bigger, a celebration of community spirit, resilience, and the power of coming together. Jamal found himself at the center of the planning committee, working tirelessly to coordinate the various elements of the event. As he sat in yet another planning meeting, surrounded by enthusiastic neighbors, he couldn't help but marvel at how much had changed in just a few short months. "Jamal," called out Sarah, one of the committee members, "we've been thinking. This event isn't just about Mrs. Henderson anymore. It's about all of us, about what we've accomplished together. We want to honor everyone who's made a difference." Jamal nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "I couldn't agree more. What did you have in mind?" The ideas came thick and fast. There would be a ceremony to recognize key community members, including Jamal himself, much to his embarrassment. Local businesses offered to provide food and drinks. The Parks Department agreed to set up a stage in the Central Park for speeches and performances. As the plans came together, word spread throughout the neighborhood. The excitement was palpable, with everyone eager to contribute in some way. Children made decorations in school, retirees organized a bake sale, and local musicians volunteered to perform. On the day of the event, the park was transformed. Colorful banners fluttered in the breeze, the aroma of grilled food filled the air, and the sound of laughter and conversation created a joyful atmosphere. People of all ages milled about, many wearing t-shirts emblazoned with the event's slogan, "Together, we're stronger." As the formal part of the event began, Jamal found himself standing at the podium, looking out over a sea of familiar faces. He took a deep breath, suddenly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "When I first knocked on Mrs. Henderson's door all those months ago," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed crowd, "I had no idea where that simple act would lead us. I just knew that someone needed help, and I couldn't turn away." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Mrs. Henderson, seated in the front row. She smiled at him, nodding encouragingly. "What happened next was nothing short of miraculous," Jamal continued. "Not because of anything I did, but because of what all of you did. You opened your hearts, you reached out to your neighbors, you showed that when we come together, there's no challenge we can't overcome." As Jamal spoke, he could see heads nodding, eyes glistening with unshed tears. He talked about the changes they had made, the new support systems, the friendships formed, the barriers broken down. But he also spoke of the work still to be done, the ongoing commitment needed to ensure that no one in their community ever felt alone or unprotected again. "This isn't the end of our journey," he concluded. "It's just the beginning. We've shown what's possible when we look out for one another. Now, let's keep that spirit alive. Let's continue to build a community where everyone feels valued, everyone feels safe, and no one is left behind." As Jamal stepped down from the podium to thunderous applause, he was immediately engulfed in a sea of hugs and handshakes. But his eyes sought out Mrs. Henderson, who was making her way towards him with the help of her walking stick. When she reached him, she took both his hands in hers. "Jamal," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how to thank you for all you've done." Jamal shook his head, smiling gently. "Mrs. Henderson, you don't need to thank me. You're the one who inspired all of this. Your courage, your resilience, that's what brought us all together." As they stood there, surrounded by the warmth and energy of their community, both Jamal and Mrs. Henderson felt a profound sense of gratitude and hope. They had been through so much, individually and as a community, but they had emerged stronger, more united, and more determined than ever to create a neighborhood where everyone looked out for one another. The celebration continued well into the evening, with music, dancing, and countless stories shared. It was more than just a party. It was a reaffirmation of the values that had brought them together, and a promise to continue building on the foundation they had laid. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the festive scene, Jamal looked around at the smiling faces, the new friendships being formed, the old barriers being broken down. He realized that they had created something truly special, not just an event, but a living, breathing community that would continue to grow and evolve long after this day was over. As the community celebration wound down, a seed of an idea began to take root. The event had showcased not just the unity of the neighborhood, but also the hidden talents of many of its residents. Local musicians had performed, amateur chefs had prepared delicious dishes, and artists had displayed their work. But one performance in particular had captured everyone's attention and sparked an exciting new possibility. Mrs. Henderson, encouraged by her newfound confidence and the supportive atmosphere, had taken to the stage to sing. Her voice, though softened by age, still carried the richness and emotion of her jazz club days. The crowd had fallen silent, mesmerized by her performance, and when she finished, the applause was thunderous. In the days following the event, word of Mrs. Henderson's performance spread, and with it, a growing enthusiasm for showcasing the community's artistic talents. It was Jamal who first proposed the idea of organizing a proper community concert, with Mrs. Henderson as the headline act. The suggestion was met with immediate approval. Planning began in earnest, with a committee formed to handle the logistics. A date was set, a venue secured, the same park where the community celebration had been held, and auditions were arranged to select local acts to perform alongside Mrs. Henderson. As the weeks passed, excitement built. Posters appeared in shop windows, social media buzzed with updates, and rehearsals began in earnest. Mrs. Henderson, despite initial nervousness, threw herself into preparations with gusto. Jamal, true to his promise, accompanied her on guitar during practice sessions. These rehearsals became a highlight for both of them. In Mrs. Henderson's cozy living room, surrounded by the memorabilia of her past career, they worked through old jazz standards and even a few more contemporary songs. Jamal was constantly amazed by Mrs. Henderson's musical knowledge and her ability to bring emotion to every lyric. "You know, Jamal," Mrs. Henderson said during one of their breaks, her eyes twinkling with mischief, "I think we make quite the duo. We should take this show on the road after the concert." Jamal laughed, strumming a playful chord on his guitar. "I don't know about that, Mrs. H. I think you might be out of my league." As the day of the concert approached, a nervous energy settled over the community. For many of the performers, this would be their first time on stage. For Mrs. Henderson, it represented a return to a passion she had thought long lost. The morning of the event dawned bright and clear. Volunteers arrived early to set up chairs, hang decorations, and prepare the stage. As the hours ticked by, people began to arrive, first in a trickle, then in a steady stream. By the time the first act was ready to perform, the park was packed. The concert was a celebration of local talent. There were solo singers, small bands, a children's choir, and even a stand-up comedian. Each act was met with enthusiastic applause, the audience reveling in the discovery of their neighbors' hidden talents. As the evening wore on, anticipation built for the final performance. When Jamal finally stepped onto the stage to introduce Mrs. Henderson, a hush fell over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jamal said, his voice carrying across the park, "it's my great honor to introduce our final performer. She's not just a talented singer, but a beacon of strength and resilience for our community. Please welcome Mrs. Evelyn Henderson." The applause was deafening as Mrs. Henderson made her way to the microphone. She looked out over the sea of faces, took a deep breath, and began to sing. Her voice, rich and emotive, filled the air with the opening notes of "What a Wonderful World." As she sang, Jamal accompanied her on guitar, their practiced harmonies blending perfectly. The audience was spellbound, many wiping away tears as Mrs. Henderson's voice carried them through the lyrics of hope and beauty. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of profound silence before the park erupted in a standing ovation. Mrs. Henderson beamed, her eyes shining with joy and unshed tears. She reached out to clasp Jamal's hand, and together they took a bow. As they left the stage, surrounded by well-wishers and congratulations, both Jamal and Mrs. Henderson felt a sense of completion. This concert represented more than just a musical performance. It was a testament to the healing power of community, to the strength found in supporting one another, and to the joy of rediscovering long-buried passions. The concert had started as a celebration of Mrs. Henderson's journey. But it had become so much more. It was a symbol of the community's transformation, a vivid demonstration of how they had come together to support one of their own, and, in the process, discovered the wealth of talent and compassion that had been lying dormant among them. As the crowd began to disperse, still buzzing with excitement from the performances, Jamal and Mrs. Henderson found a quiet moment away from the hubbub. They sat on a bench at the edge of the park, watching as the last streaks of sunset painted the sky in vibrant hues. "I never thought I'd sing on stage again," Mrs. Henderson said softly, her voice tinged with wonder. "Thank you, Jamal, for everything." Jamal shook his head, a gentle smile on his face. "Mrs. Henderson, you did this. Your courage, your talent, that's what inspired everyone. I just played backup." Mrs. Henderson chuckled, patting his hand. "Well, you play a mean backup, young man. We make quite the team." As they sat there, basking in the afterglow of the successful event, neither of them could have anticipated the final twist that their story was about to take. The days following the concert were filled with a palpable sense of accomplishment and unity. The event had been more than just a showcase of local talent. It had become a symbol of the community's transformation. People walked the streets with a newfound spring in their step, greeting neighbors they once would have passed by without a second glance. For Mrs. Henderson, the concert had reignited a passion she thought long extinguished. She found herself humming tunes as she went about her day, her fingers itching to play the piano that had sat unused in her living room for years. The fear and isolation that had once defined her life seemed like a distant memory. Jamal, too, felt the positive effects of the concert. His role in organizing the event and supporting Mrs. Henderson had cemented his status as a community leader. He found himself fielding requests for advice, invitations to local meetings, and even a few suggestions that he should run for local office. It was during one of his now regular visits to Mrs. Henderson that the conversation took an unexpected turn. They were sitting in her living room, Jamal strumming idly on his guitar, while Mrs. Henderson leafed through an old photo album. "You know, Jamal," she began, her voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking a lot about the past lately, about the choices I've made, the roads not taken." Jamal set his guitar aside, sensing the weight in her words. "What kind of choices, Mrs. H?" Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the outline of an old photograph. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I never told you why that man, why he was threatening me." Jamal felt a chill run down his spine. They had never discussed the details of Mrs. Henderson's abuse, respecting her privacy and focusing instead on her recovery. "You don't have to tell me if you're not comfortable, Mrs. Henderson." She shook her head, a sad smile on her face. "No, I think it's time. You see, Jamal, that man, he's my son." The revelation hit Jamal like a physical blow. He stared at Mrs. Henderson, struggling to process this new information. "Your son?" he finally managed to choke out. Mrs. Henderson nodded, tears welling in her eyes. My only child. He fell into a bad crowd years ago. Drugs, mostly. When my husband died, leaving me alone, I thought I could help him. But instead, he took advantage of you. Jamal finished softly, understanding dawning on him. He needed money for his habit, Mrs. Henderson continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. At first, I gave it willingly, hoping it would help him get back on his feet. But it was never enough. When I finally refused, he became violent. Jamal reached out, taking Mrs. Henderson's hand in his own. I'm so sorry, Mrs. H. I had no idea. She squeezed his hand, offering a watery smile. No one did. I was too ashamed to tell anyone. My own son. I thought I had failed him somehow. You didn't fail anyone, Mrs. Henderson, Jamal said firmly. You were trying to help. He's the one who failed you. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of this revelation hanging between them. Finally, Mrs. Henderson spoke again, her voice filled with a mix of sorrow and hope. I've been thinking, now that he's in custody, maybe this is his chance to get help, to turn his life around. I know it sounds foolish after everything he's done, but he's still your son, Jamal finished, understanding in his eyes. Mrs. Henderson nodded, relief evident on her face at being understood. Yes, he's still my son. And maybe, just maybe, this is the wake-up call he needed. As they continued to talk, exploring the complex emotions this revelation had stirred up, Jamal felt a renewed sense of admiration for Mrs. Henderson. Even after everything she had been through, she still had room in her heart for hope and forgiveness. The conversation stretched late into the evening, touching on themes of family, forgiveness, and the sometimes painful path to healing. As Jamal finally rose to leave, he felt as though he was seeing Mrs. Henderson in a new light, not just as a victim or a survivor, but as a woman of incredible strength and compassion. As he walked home under the starlit sky, Jamal reflected on how this latest revelation would impact their tight-knit community. The story of Mrs. Henderson and her son was a powerful reminder that behind closed doors, people often face challenges far more complex than they appeared on the surface. He realized that their work as a community was far from over. There would be new challenges to face, new stories to uncover, and new opportunities to support one another. But Jamal felt ready for whatever came next. They had built something special in this neighborhood. A true community, bound together by compassion, understanding, and a shared commitment to looking out for one another. As he reached his own front door, Jamal made a silent promise. They would continue to build on the foundation they had laid, creating a community where everyone felt safe to share their struggles, where no one had to face their demons alone, and where hope and second chances were always within reach. The weeks that followed Mrs. Henderson's revelation were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. The news of her son's involvement in her abuse sent shockwaves through the community, challenging the newfound sense of security and unity they had worked so hard to build. Jamal found himself at the center of it all, working tirelessly to navigate the complex emotions and reactions of his neighbors. Some were angry, feeling betrayed by the revelation. Others were overwhelmed with sympathy for Mrs. Henderson, struggling to imagine the pain she must have endured. Still, others were simply confused, unsure how to reconcile this new information with the story they thought they knew. Through it all, Jamal remained a steady presence, offering support, mediating conflicts, and continually reminding everyone of the core values that had brought them together in the first place. It was during a community meeting, called to address the swirling rumors and concerns, that Mrs. Henderson decided to address her neighbors directly. The community center was packed, a tense silence falling over the room as she made her way to the front, supported by Jamal. My friends, she began, her voice quavering slightly but growing stronger as she spoke. I know many of you are hurt and confused by what you've learned. I want you to know that I never meant to deceive you. The truth was simply too painful to share. She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. My son's actions caused me great pain, it's true. But the greatest pain was in seeing what addiction had done to the boy I raised and loved. I kept silent out of shame, yes, but also out of hope that somehow, someday, he would find his way back to himself. As Mrs. Henderson spoke, sharing the full story of her son's descent into addiction and the toll it had taken on their family, the mood in the room began to shift. Anger gave way to understanding, confusion to compassion. I stand before you today, Mrs. Henderson concluded, not just as a survivor of abuse, but as a mother who still loves her son despite everything. And I'm here to ask for your help, not just for me, but for him, for all the sons and daughters out there who have lost their way. The silence that followed her words was profound. Then, slowly, people began to stand, one by one, then in groups, until the entire room was on its feet, applauding not just Mrs. Henderson's courage, but the depth of love and forgiveness she had displayed. In the days that followed, the community rallied once again, this time with a new purpose. Support groups for families dealing with addiction were formed. Fundraisers were organized to improve access to rehabilitation services. The local police department began working on new strategies for addressing drug-related crimes, with a focus on treatment rather than punishment. For Mrs. Henderson, the journey was far from over. With the support of Jamal and the community, she began visiting her son in prison, working with counselors to rebuild their relationship on healthier terms. It was a slow, often painful process, but one that brought with it the first glimmers of hope and healing. Jamal, watching all of this unfold, felt a profound sense of awe at the resilience of the human spirit and the power of community. What had started as a simple act of concern for a neighbor had blossomed into something far greater than he could have ever imagined. As he sat on his porch one evening, strumming his guitar and watching the sunset over the neighborhood he now saw with new eyes, Jamal reflected on the journey they had all taken together. They had faced fear and overcome it. They had confronted prejudice and dismantled it. They had stared into the face of despair and found hope. And through it all, they had discovered the true meaning of community. Not just a group of people living in proximity, but a family bound by compassion, understanding, and a shared commitment to supporting one another through life's darkest moments. The story of Mrs. Henderson and her son had become more than just a tale of personal struggle and redemption. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that behind every closed door, behind every facade of normalcy, there might be someone fighting a battle we know nothing about. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, Jamal began to play a familiar tune, the song he and Mrs. Henderson had performed at the community concert. As the melody drifted through the evening air, he saw lights coming on in neighboring houses, heard doors opening, felt the presence of his community gathering. And in that moment, Jamal knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They had built something precious here, a true community where every member was valued, every struggle shared, and every victory celebrated as one. The journey had been long and often difficult, but as Jamal looked out over the faces of his neighbors, now friends, now family, he knew that it had all been worth it. For in coming together to help one woman reclaim her life, they had all found something they didn't even know they were missing. A place to belong, a community to call home.